I took this week off from my day job so I could spend a little extra time working on a substantial revision of what will hopefully be my next novel, which needed and now has a new first chapter and which needs some intense resequencing in its middle act. While I'll admit I should probably also find some time for a vacation that doesn't feel like an ordeal, it has been really nice to spend a little time focusing on art to the exclusion of most other things. Tracy and I have also enjoyed a screening of Twin Peaks, Fire Walk with Me, and the collection of deleted and extended scenes called The Missing Pieces. And of course, when my brain tires out, I've been dumping hours into Slay the Spire 2. The world is falling apart, just a bit, here and there, and it's going to get worse before it gets better. But for now, my good luck holds out, and I'm grateful for every minute. This is Library Pizza, a podcast about reading. I'm Mike Meginnis. I pitched you a couple weeks ago on Liberal Currents, an essential publication for those who would like to see a renewal in the U.S. after the Trump era, so I won't review those bullet points again, but this week's guest is Adam Gurri, the founder and editor-in-chief of Liberal Currents, and I'm grateful for his time. As briefly discussed at the outset, this online magazine has just completed a fundraiser that will allow it to expand in several dimensions, including a print offering, and I'm really excited to see where they go next. I'll see you and Adam on the other side of my very dignified theme music, which was made by my partner, Tracy Rae Bowling.
Library Pizza! P-I-Z-Z-A! Library Pizza! P-I-Z-Z-A!
But I'm glad to have you, and my only complaint is the timing on this, because I need to congratulate you on the success of the Liberal Currents fundraiser, and really we were so close, because I just had Samantha on a couple weeks ago. I've got you now, and if only we had done this a little bit earlier, or the fundraiser had concluded a little bit later, I could attempt to take some kind of credit. I could say like, oh yeah, they were on this podcast that has like 1 million listeners. And then, naturally everything proceeded well from there. And of course they were massively successful as a result. So I'm really I'm kind of resenting the success that I, previously was like really hoping for. So, but congratulations.
Well, thank you. And I'm sure you'll take us to new heights.
Yes, if you start a new one of the same amount tomorrow, I have to think that we could just run it back, right? So I have been enjoying reading Liberal Currents for a while now, and I'm going to ask you to do the thing which normally I do not ask guests to do. Give a description of what the magazine is and a little bit of a pitch for it.
Okay, yeah. We are a home for liberal thought, essentially, in America, as something that is alive now, not just what I've started calling the 2 or 3 Johns version of liberalism: John Locke, John Mill, and maybe John Rawls. There's a lot more to it than that, even from back then. But for example, today I just recorded a video essay on Jacob Levy, who is an incredibly great liberal theorist that is alive right now and like one of our supporters and things like that. So we are a place to articulate the different defenses, rationales, ways of implementing liberalism today. And also now, just necessarily, we're a source of resistance to authoritarian consolidation.
Yes, which I appreciate. Always nice to resist that. Something I was curious about, because I think that my awareness of your publication has mirrored what a lot of people that are like on Blue Sky or other venues like that have experienced, which is that I know that I saw Liberal Currents articles in my feed, and I know that I read a couple before our recent disastrous election. And I'm curious for you to summarize like kind of how you see the history of the evolution and growth of the publication. But it was definitely my experience that you guys are one of the few publications, and I think it is startling how few it is actually, because I think this is a space with a lot of opportunities right now. But you guys are standing up this sort of alternative to the disastrously collapsing mainstream / right-wing media, the Washington Post is dead, and you guys are not able to like step in and fill that gap necessarily. But there has been, I feel like my impression has been that you have really been stepping up and filling a space that needs more people in it. And so that's why I was excited to see the fundraiser ultimately succeed for you guys. How do you see that last like couple years of development and where you started and how you've gotten to where you are now?
Yeah, I could start at the end rather than the beginning. So, an example of what we're working on, and I'm spending a lot of time on right now because it involves a print run, which has long, timeline requirements. We're doing an essay collection called The Reconstruction Papers. It is about a positive vision or visions for a post-Trump future, where we send the basic premise is our institutions were already in trouble before Trump came along and destroyed them, which is more or less what he's done. So we need a game plan for how to build them better. One example is I got an expert in higher education to write what should be the drastic changes we make in that area after Trump. We all, you get in this sort of reactive position when you're dealing with Trump and people like him, where we want to protect what he's destroying, but I don't think we want to actually go back to the way it was before he did that. We all know about the tuition problem, student debt problems. We all know about the sort of horrible adjunct professor experience pyramid where you have a handful of tenured professors making bank, and a huge bottom of the pyramid of adjuncts that are very marginally attached and barely employed. So, what's the way to reshape this? We have something on that. We have something about the public funding of science, which is very important, but also had grown kind of rigid before Trump. Nevertheless, him destroying it is an unmitigated disaster. If we had just kept going the way we were, obviously that would be better than what we have now. But we want to do better than that. So part of what we want to do is, from a liberal perspective, say, what is doing better than that for the 21st century after Trump? That's one part of it. The other part of it is essentially what you're saying, which is just having integrity as liberals, and having the liberal point of view and understanding that means like being pro-trans, for example, and pro-immigration without feeling the need to caveat that in an environment where a lot of the left-leaning or liberal-leaning institutions are wobbling or equivocating or just sort of watering down their position because they're under attack. Yeah, so that's where we are. Where we began way back in 2017 was much more philosophical and abstract. The point I just made about Jacob Levy and John Locke and stuff like that. That was much more our fare in 2017. We saw the problem with Trump. We decided to launch, but most of us had a more abstract academic intellectual background. So the toolkit we brought to it was much more about focusing on the idea that liberalism had gotten complacent. And I always draw the comparison with Jacobin. So Jacobin's approach was that socialism had been discredited and stigmatized, but it was still a legitimate intellectual tradition. So they wanted to stand up for it and be the premier publication where you read about it in America. We wanted to do the same for liberalism, which wasn't stigmatized or discredited, though some people were saying that it was, but so much as it was so successful for so long that a lot of the people who even believed in it didn't know why they believed in it. And a lot of the values, people weren't even sure what the rationale was for them anymore. So we spent a lot of time, and we still do, articulating the reasons for those things. Over time, we invested a lot more in political science knowledge and knowledge of activism and things like that to be able to write concretely about institutional reform or institutional problems and what we should be doing in response to specific things. So that's a lot more of what we do right now. And obviously after 2024, that was the major focus. I pre-wrote something before Trump was elected that I published that week. That was just essentially, here's every single institutional lever we can use to sandbag the federal government for the next 4 years. I like to joke that after November 4th, 2024, we all became states' rights and pro-judicial review and, pro-filibuster.
Yeah, I absolutely got really interested in all of the institutional political choke points that previously I had thought of as potential problems, and now is like, I love these. Right. There's nothing I'm more excited about than states' rights.
Right. Well, so for example, we're very YIMBY publication, very pro building housing. But then recently, a bunch of NIMBYs have actually blocked the construction of ice facilities. So it's like, we got to hand it to them for that one, right?
Yeah, I'm glad we have them on our side in this one case.
Right, exactly. This is a true popular front. Like, this is as broad as it gets.
Yeah. You talked about kind of the weird like problem of success that liberalism has had, and I feel like I definitely have experienced this in my own life where I like started paying any attention to politics like in college when one does. That was back in like 2004 2008, and I knew that I hated the Bush administration. I knew that I wanted the Democratic Party to generally win elections, but I also knew that I was cooler and smarter than most of the people around me. And so I was like, I'm pretty sure I'm a leftist. Like, if I think about it, I feel like I have to be. And I remember these like disastrous conversations where I would kind of try lines out to see like, is this in fact what I think? I'm going to say this to somebody else, and we're going to see how crazy it sounds coming out of my mouth. And I won't repeat some of them, but there were moments where it was like, I feel like I'm pretty sure I can explain everything about history by looking at the material conditions that determine the direction of things. And like basically I was doing like really crude, ignorant Marxism that conveniently did not require me to read Marx, which I've not really gotten around to doing it in any great length. But like I feel like the dynamic is everybody says that everything is gender now, but if anything, I think it understates like how much that is exactly the experience we're having.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like liberalism is so much mom. Right? The Democratic Party is mom, but liberalism generally is mom. And what I mean by that is there is a force that has been structuring the national household and has been determining the way that things are going to run. And there have been moments where we maybe understood that was happening and we gave that force some credit. But in my life, it's mostly been, why hasn't mom protected us from dad? Why hasn't mom structured things so perfectly that even when dad like finds his way out of his drunken stupor and, starts to try to take things over again, why hasn't she like locked him out of the bank account? Why hasn't she taken his keys?
Right.
Why isn't she standing up for us and taking care of us? But without the recognition that we were depending on mom to do those things for so long. And it's this obnoxious, thankless thing. And like, you hear people talk about this, and I imagine that if you're not like super sympathetic to liberalism or to the Democratic Party in this situation, you're like, well, get over it. Stop having your feelings hurt and, take care of us anyway, as one says to mom. But I really think that like is what has been going on. And right now, whatever I have thought of myself, whatever I've thought of my own feelings about politics in the past, 20 years where I've slowly become an actually functioning adult. In this moment right now, God, I want mom back. And it's such a humiliating, childish way to relate to politics, right? To be reduced to feeling that way. And I really would prefer that we just not gender liberalism, and this was not the structure that determines the way that we understand our relationship to each other. But nonetheless, that's what it is. That's where I am, is like, I am now appreciating mom and simultaneously really wishing that wasn't how this works.
Yeah. Yeah, I get that. Of course, gender is a big topic at liberal currents. It's a funny one for me because it was not my topic, and it was not necessarily a topic. I'd say of the three co-founders with Jason Brigham and Paul Kreider, Paul is probably the one who delved the deepest into it. But then, of course, we brought on Samantha Hancock-Lee, who you've had on, and she's just excellent on that topic. And then in the Reconstruction Papers collection that we're doing, we have someone who has a real barn burner on the topic as well. And I mean, I'm convinced. It's not like I was skeptical or something. I just was, again, one learns as one goes. And Samantha's writings on gender just completely on the nose about these things, writing about the weird gender affirming things that the right does with steroids and makeup and like too much makeup and the weird, performance of it.
Yeah, I remember there was this blog post I read back around that that same time I was talking about, like, I think I was probably in college or grad school. And this is back in the era of a blog post being a thing that a person read. Whereas now, like, we have to hide the fact that things are blogs, right? Like, it's not a blog, it's a magazine. But like, so there was a blog post I read around that time that was really formative for me in exactly the way that it did not want to be, which was this writer was saying, the reason that I can't get on board with liberalism is that there's this expectation that you're going to serve the omni cause, right? Like, I'm interested in feminism. I'm interested in these other things that affect me personally or people that I know, but I don't really want to get into all this other stuff. I don't really want to have to learn about it because, that's just not where my interest is. But were I a liberal, were I a Democrat, I would be expected to come with all of those things and to serve as a good member of that coalition and show up for people when I don't even necessarily understand the things that they're concerned about and this stuff. And they were writing about this and they're like, and it's so exhausting and I just don't have it in me. And I'm sitting here like, well, this is what I actually have to do, right? Like, you're describing to the extent that I'm capable of that as a human being.
Yeah.
Like, it feels like that should be the goal, right?
Yeah. That's funny.
So I wanted to ask you though about your own reading life, which I imagine with the work that you do with the magazine as somewhat overwhelming because it feels like to some extent what you're doing right now is reading for a living. Is that fair? And like, how much is it?
Well, right. That's kind of an issue is that I'm reading so much submissions and things like that it's difficult to get in the book reading that I want. But in general, I go through sort of like blocks of reading where I try and stick with a topic. What happened in 2017 specifically is that I would follow the news with Trump and he would do something, there would be a reaction to it. And then there'd be a pushback and say, there's more precedent here than you think. Or, Obama did something similar, like in immigration. Obama was doing more similar things. And it wasn't that I took for face value that those responses were correct, so much as that I realized my state of knowledge was such that I couldn't actually adjudicate them. So I spent a long time just reading a lot about the American system. And then I went through a subsequent reading phase in comparative politics because my feeling is that you can't actually understand any system without understanding the alternatives. And so, I do things like that. Had Trump lost, I probably would have been finishing up a project on the Open Society, but specifically, like, I was reading about ethnic conflict specifically, because to me, that's kind of a skeleton key to understanding a lot of other things about the modern world. And why, for example, anti-immigration politics just crops up absolutely everywhere. Whether you're a democracy or not, there's always immigration restriction. And why is that? So I wanted to sort of build this big and potentially write a book that was, here are the basic headwinds against open societies, why there's always this pressure to close things down more, even when you have it. But here are also the tailwinds that push in that direction. And the tailwinds are things like, right now, unlike any other time in history, the technology exists such that a very small group of people can make a lot of trouble for a government if they want to, which means there's very good reason to want to, if possible, institutionalize the process of people being in conflict with the current administration or regime, right? Like you want to have these pressure valves where people can vote against you, people can speak against you, and people can organize against you peacefully because it's very easy for them to not do it peacefully. They're not going to beat you militarily, usually. Very rare for that to happen if you have anything like a decent state-run military. But they can guerrilla fight you forever. If you don't, insurgency is a thing that you cannot just defeat with military force. It is something you have to defeat by creating the right social conditions. And those social conditions are mostly like the open society. They're providing means of, they're both democracy, but they're liberal democracy. They're tolerance for communities that are different to organize themselves and to some extent have some autonomy. And then, like I said, there are these feedback loops for the ones that are in power, given that are broadly available to everyone. So that's the kind of thing that I was very interested in. And I wrote something last year called The Totalitarian Logic of Immigration Restriction that was inspired by this one thinker, Chandran Kukathis, who writes about that, but also went into this question of why is it that we keep falling into this? Why do we keep doing this everywhere? When there's a surge of immigration that hits an immigration restriction regime, which is everything at this point, it always ends in camps. Not necessarily in mass death, not necessarily in concentration camps of the death camp sort, but it always ends in these inhumane conditions, sticking tons of people in them that don't do well. There's usually sickness or something. There usually is some death at least because of that. But then this sort of just like very not human rights respecting approach to herding people like cattle and then booting them out of the country somewhere. Why does this recurringly happen? So that's something that I got into, and that's sort of the payoff of that particular reading research project that I was doing. But yeah, right now I'm mostly just buried in submissions. I am hoping to get to a few things this year though.
I want to come back to the submissions and being buried in them, but I was thinking how what you were talking about has seemed to me like sort of the massive problem that we don't really have a clear solution to, that is looking forward. We're really going to need one, and we're going to wish that we developed one early. And the reason I say that is that, to me, there's a lot of things that are concerning about climate change, but I've tended to think that people underrate the extent to which people can solve these problems, right? Like I remember the early in the Trump 2 experience, there were a lot of people making arguments that sounded very credible to me as a non-expert, that the stuff that he was doing to international trade was going to cause this cascading disaster that was going to blow everything up and prices were going to go nuts. And like, he has recently found a way to maybe finally actually make that happen. He tried flying the plane into the mountain one way. It didn't work. So now he's going to try and crash it a different way that I think may work.
Yeah.
But like my suspicion has been that the explanation for that not going the way that people suspected it would is that like the qualities of the economy and of human ingenuity that created the system we currently enjoy also allow it to adapt and find new pathways. Like there were new ways to source things. Trade was happening in different directions. Like people found their way around that. And I think that there are reasons to think that with climate change, we'll be a little more robust than we expect to be in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
But one way it does not look like we will be more robust than expected is the anticipated movement of people, right? Like there's an expectation, it's already happening, and we believe it will happen more. People are going to be flooding from countries into other countries. They're going to be fleeing situations that genuinely cannot stay, where they will die if they do not leave the place where they live now. And that has been the thing that has scared the shit out of me, and that has seemed like it was going to lead to a global right reaction that is happening like sort of in advance of a lot of it, right?
Yeah.
I guess I don't have a thought or a question about that so much as like that's a thing that I've been thinking about for a long time and wishing that I knew what we were going to do about it. And so it's interesting to me that that's been a focus for you. And I'm curious about like anything you would summarize as far as what that research and that writing experience has left you with so far.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, our status quo for a lot of this stuff is so bad that the optimistic take is there is a ton of room for improvement. And in America specifically, that improvement isn't even in absolute levels of people you let in or whatever, but just in like our structure is so Byzantine. I don't know, there's a chart that's put out by I think David Beers that is a flow chart of the immigration process, and it takes up your entire screen, and it's just insane. And just simply having a system that quickly says yes or no, one way or the other, would already be 1,000 times an improvement over what we have now, right? Because that like maybe yes, and you're in sort of legal limbo. That's why so many people are specifically vulnerable to the Trump administration now, is they have a lot of levers as the executive branch to be like, well, okay, everyone else was just a decent person and gave you the benefit of the doubt and went about this lawfully, but actually we're just going to cancel everything and put people in camps. Even though they did everything the right way, it's just really hard to do things the right way. So we just need to make things easy to do the right way. And if that means that we say no more than I would like, which is frankly, there's no way that it's not going to be more than I like, that it's better to at least do that in a humane way. The other angle is immigration simply should have the same due process rights as everyone else. There should not be this, well, you're not a citizen, so we don't have to give you a right to trial or something. Like that just shouldn't that's just such a loophole for, okay, we're saying this person isn't a citizen and we're not checking,
Right.
like it's just not it. And organizations like ICE, which we should get rid of and replace with something else, and be more like the old INS, which already had its own problems, but is drastically better than ICE. They just should conduct themselves like the FBI. They should have to do actual investigative work and actually make the case that such and so is not a citizen. Frankly, if they're not a citizen, it's usually not that hard to prove it. So, I mean, they have to actually do the work though. They have to actually have a court look at it, or the other side, do a plea deal of some kind to do it. There's a lot of things we can do. Is long story short, but the real like big picture thing that you're talking about is we just need a new settlement. Like in 1965, we had a new settlement in the United States specifically about immigration. We need a new settlement in the United States that liberals need to lead so that it's relatively pro-open movement, but it has to be lawful, it has to be orderly, because I think what we found in the Biden administration was that even if a lot of the people who came as asylum seekers were going to be kicked back out at the end, like their asylum was not going to be approved, just having the perception of a large disorderly process is enough to polarize against immigration. But like Canada has immigrants at a level of like 1% of their population a year. We can do at least that. I think we can do better, but we can do it orderly. It just takes, you have to actually improve the administration of it and then invest in the kinds of services that Canada invests in. So that's America. But to your point, what we actually need is a international settlement on it as well. And that's where there's a real problem, because I actually, despite the moment we're living in, I actually am cautiously optimistic that we could have a good arrangement in the United States, because we have before, and 20% of our country is still foreign born or descended from foreign born. Like we still have a huge like my dad's an immigrant. My great grandparents on my mom's side are all immigrants. So before the 20th century, none of my family is in the United States. And I'm not a rare case at all. So there's a lot of us who have very recent memory of it. I think we know from 2024 and even 2020 that that doesn't mean that you're guaranteed to win those voters on a pro-immigration side, but I think you can make the case to them. And there is a tradition of immigration here, and we actually are good at integrating immigrants, better than most rich countries, other than Canada, frankly. So I am relatively optimistic that we could do it. Internationally, it's more difficult, though. The European countries. I hate to say it, but the right-wing criticism of European countries is true. The right-wing criticism that they brag about a lot of things, but they have much more homogenous countries. And the way that a lot of them got homogenous countries was through ethnic cleansing and genocide and forced population transfers. There's sort of this like, okay, we get to start fresh after World War II and pursue social democracy. And that's great. It's great that they pursued that. There's so much that we should emulate about what they do. But they are incredibly fragile to immigration politics now, because they did that upfront horrible atrocities for 20 or 30 years that got them to the particular country compositions they're at now, and it makes it harder for them to change. So that's going to be harder for Europe. It's going to be harder, and Europe, frankly, it's America's in a bad state right now, and we could very well just become fascist, and that would be the worst possible outcome. So the variance in our possible outcomes is large, and the bad are really bad. But with Europe, it's just hard to see what the path is for them to actually do better. I don't like and you can see the path to them getting worse too. Their right wing has been growing for longer than ours in terms of that. They've just been sort of like more slowly, gradually creeping up. And in some places like Italy, they actually did take it. But yeah, so that's hard. But even not Europe, I mean, Japan does more immigration now than it used to. It's still not a lot by like American standards. South Korea, very homogenous place. These are places where, the growth miracles of the 20th century in liberal democracies that are not in Europe or the United States, they're just not very immigration friendly places. So in many ways, the countries one would hope would actually grow a lot, and could be sources of hope would be in the Americas, because the big places that experience a lot of diversity and immigration are American countries, not just the United States. But that's not essentially, like, I just don't think everything I think has a natural ceiling to how much they can grow economically and how much they can grow as a society if they don't find some way to integrate relatively large levels of immigration in and out into their society and politics. And there's a lot of countries that are going to struggle with that. Frankly, most of people's contenders for the crown, if not the United States, right? Europe, China too, not exactly a high immigration country. Xi, among many other things, very much an ethnic nationalist in his approach to how they treat the minorities that are already in China, never mind immigration. And then, yeah, the other East Asian countries that have grown quickly, they're not exactly chomping at the bit for high levels of immigration. India is an interesting case because they actually are built for pluralism, but they also are going through a long moment, this kind of like nationalizing, homogenizing political dominance, on their side. So they're difficult. But perhaps perhaps India is a country. I could imagine a future India that is very pro-immigration relative to the rest of the world.
Yeah, you talk about South Korea and Japan as examples, and I spent back in the right after the 2024 election, I unexpectedly spent about 6 weeks in South Korea, and it was a very interesting and novel experience for me as a white guy in the Midwest to be in a place where like literally I would be in a train car with 100 people crammed in. I have no idea. So many people, like to
Yeah.
the point where there wasn't room to lift your arms in the really heavy part. And I would be the only white guy there, and I'd be the only white guy if you include like the next like 3 train cars in either direction. And everybody was really nice and tolerant, and it was a really nice place to spend time. I'm sure some of the folks there were extremely sick of me immediately or after dealing with my not Korean knowing ass for 5 seconds. Like I don't have any illusions about that, but people were nice, but like they are dealing with the demographic drop off. My memory is that they are actually worse than
Now they are.
Japan in this
Yeah.
regard, which
Yeah.
is incredible because Japan is worse than us by a healthy margin, and we're pretty bad.
We have gotten bad. Yeah, we've gotten bad.
Where for folks who don't know, there's like this, we could solve so much so quickly by just letting people come in, because so many of the things that we don't feel we can necessarily afford in the long term is because we have this top heavy demographic structure, and it's even worse in South Korea, where the gender relations have gotten so bad that like if you're a woman who wants to like live your own life over there, my impression is that in many cases you just don't get married. And the alternative to getting married is not having, a different arrangement that works for you a little more specifically and personally. It's just like, you're not going to have kids. You're not going to have kids. You're not going to have, if you're straight, you're not going to have romantic relationships necessarily. And it is so frustrating here in the US. Like you said, like we have had better approaches to this before, and we could again. I definitely was one of those people who, before, Trump came into office, I had a very different understanding of what our immigration situation is. I did sort of buy into the myth that it was like really, you could do it. If you were careful and patient and you dotted your I's, crossed your T's, we would let you have citizenship. And now every time I meet someone who has successfully immigrated here, I have to restrain myself from asking, how the fuck
How did you do it? How did you do it?
Because like if they're rich, then I know the answer, right? Like there are some people where I talk to them and I'm like, I know how you did it. It's because you had the safety and the resources to just kind of throw yourself at this and trust it to work out.
Yeah.
But for people who aren't, I genuinely don't understand it. And I'm careful about how I talk about my day job for a number of reasons, but I work in a context where I am often responsible, despite not really having expertise in this, for helping people who are going to come to train to be doctors in the U.S.
Okay.
make the move over here, get visas that allow them to do their training here, and the disaster that the last couple of years have been for dealing with those people, where they are constantly being given new reasons not to trust us, not to come here, and if they are here, not to trust that we're going to let them finish their training here before they get done, before they get kicked out.
Yeah.
It's been so stupidly destructive. I don't know that people fully appreciate like that. That's one of the things that I feel like is going to be really damaging to us long term that we just can't see now, is like how much
trust
people don't trust us now.
Yes, trust is key. I mean, in everything, right? Like just domestically, is someone going to want to try and go through a medical school process, not knowing what the heck the federal government is going to do to their med school in the meantime, or the hospitals that they would get employed by? Is someone going to want to? Is another country going to want to invest in opening a factory here? There's so many things. Like we just don't see how much trust matters. That's what I mean by a new settlement. Like it's got to actually be a settlement, right? It's got to actually be, here is our new deal. We are giving you something to help you come on board with it. If you see us like sticking to the terms for a few years, we'll win some of your trust back. But yeah, like in general, that's what we need, right? Like we need it domestically and we need it internationally, because it's not just the last year. It's both. It's the fact that he won once on a fluke, but then we voted for him again, not a fluke, meaning that this could happen again. So we have to do a lot of things. It's just got to be a lot, right? We have to do things to rein in presidential power one way or another, and we have ideas about that. We have to strengthen Congress and make it functional, actually, because that's the way you actually institutionalize things. A legislature, and especially like a two-chamber one like ours, a legislature, it doesn't do things, it can't do things as quickly as a single executive can. And when it does it, that it represents a relatively broad support in the country to do so, especially if it does it and then keeps doing it after, multiple election rounds or something. Whereas presidents really can be flukes, and they really can change things on a dime. And, I don't think it's fair criticism of Obama, but it is a fair criticism of our system that the Iran deal that he brokered was something that could just be torn up on a dime by a president, because it didn't go through like our treaty process or something. It just wouldn't have succeeded through our treaty process, right? It's too onerous and difficult. So we have to figure out things that actually can be done, but are more demanding than just a president waking up and deciding to do it. So there's a lot of things like that need to be done, and immigration is definitely one of them. And I think like you just got to like, we have some immigration lawyers in the community, and they can just tell you like 500 different of these categories, where you just have to get rid of a lot of the categories we have of legal people legally being here, and also like the categories of you're in violation of being here, and just simplify the hell out of it.
Yeah.
Because all that we've done now is created a bunch of backstop and complexity that's easy to prey on if you are a Donald Trump or Stephen Miller. So yeah, I mean, that's 100% agree. It's all about trust.
So talking about being buried in submissions, yes. I will briefly summarize my relationship to this phenomenon, which I think is probably, I'm hoping for your sake, it's a little different from yours. And I have reasons to think it would be. So the reason I say that is I got an MFA in fiction. I was, I majored in undergrad in creative writing as well. And so a huge learning experience for me, and something I would certainly recommend anybody working in those fields, is that I worked on literary magazines. And literary magazines, if they are open to submissions, they have what is called the slush. Yeah. And you get literally thousands of stories, thousands of poems, thousands of essays, and they are garbage. Right? Like the majority of them. The nice part is you can read about 3 words literally and say, you know what? No, like this one isn't going to work out, and you reject it and you move on to the next. So people don't like writers. Writers are sensitive sometimes about the idea that you didn't finish their thing. But like if you've ever worked on the other side of it, you know that is an absolute necessity to anything.
Yeah, it's impossible. Done. It's impossible.
Yeah. And it's like, but at the same time, you are you are going to be accurate in your rejections. Acceptances are tricky, but rejections can be surprisingly simple because just you don't. Of course, you're not going to publish most stuff you see. So I have this experience of being just totally inundated for years with stuff that I would read for 3 seconds and I'd say, no, this isn't going to work. Thank you very much. And then there's that small percentage where you say, no, but I did finish it and I would be interested to read more. And it is a tremendous learning experience, but it is also overwhelming, and you end up having a staff of graduate and undergraduate students usually who are your first line of defense, who are responsible for doing that first culling in a lot of institutions. When I was managing editor for the literary magazine I worked on, we didn't really use folks that way. I was the first line of defense as much as anybody because I was willing to go in and just do that culling at high speed.
Yeah.
But all of which is to say, it is demanding at the best of times. My guess from what I've seen in how Liberal Currents works, I'm betting you have a stronger pool than the average literary magazine, and I'm betting you don't have to cull nearly that aggressively. But I'm curious, what your experience of that work is and how it's been over the last couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, so we were very small in 2024, and then we grew a lot in 2025. And then the fundraiser itself was a kind of marketing that made us grow a lot in the last few months. So, we have fits and starts of submissions over the years. And then I'll put out a call for it, or I'll reach out to people specifically that I want to write for us. But we've had a pretty steady stream this year, and I've rejected a lot. I've accepted a lot so our process is we say yes or no to a pitch. If we say yes to the pitch, then we review your draft, and we might still say no. So I have a very long list of drafts right now that in a backlog that I have to actually seriously read through and consider. So we're definitely refining that process, I would say. But yeah, I would say the average is definitely it's not like literary slush pile level stuff. There's a lot of stuff that's more like this is obvious or this could be written better, but obviously that's what editors are for. It's more like we're also getting more and more thoughtful about what kind of intervention do we want to have in certain debates. So yeah, I mean it's not I don't think it's anywhere near a larger publication level of the pitches they get, or literary magazine in terms of just how indulgent the writing can get when submitted to that. There's I would say the worst you can say is that there's often people that write like college students, and then of course there is the extra wrinkle of there are people who are clearly using AI. Which thankfully so far has been of a lower quantity than I would have feared. But it's even obvious in the pitch often. The pitch often is written in a very particular tone and style that sounds like an AI's response to your prompt. And the pitches become very structured in ways that most pitches I get are not, frankly.
Yeah.
So, but it's not like I can prove it, right?
Right.
So sometimes if the topic is interesting enough, I asked for the first draft of them, but mostly I've rejected anything I suspected. Yeah, so that's the main thing.
I'm dealing with a thing right now, and I bet you're seeing some version of this. I think any writer with a publicly available email address is probably getting this, where basically every day I get 2 or 3 pitches from a person who in kayfabe, in the fiction of the email, is some sort of a captain of a network of reviewers or a big book club, and they have some very specific feedback on my last book. Yes. And what they think it accomplishes and how. And this is the part that kills you. It sounds credible every time because what they've done is they've summarized. They've taken the average of Goodreads reviews and the reviews that were in the Washington Post or whatever, and they put them together and they're using it to flatter me, which of course is seductive. And then at the end of it, they say, please email me and we can continue this conversation. And 99% of the time, I think I am catching them successfully. I've got this one person that I think might be real, and I just don't know how to deal with the conversation. Because when I've tried, the last time I tried reaching out to somebody who sent me the AI pitch, I was like, are you a real person? And of course they wrote back, what they did what the AI would do if instructed, which is great question. Of course I'm a real person, but I understand why you're asking. And then they took me through some more of the, God knows how it works, but it has been awful for me. And I cannot imagine what people who actually have something that anybody else wants are dealing with.
Yeah.
I think I have seen you talk about, because I'm curious about like the little bit of reading for enjoyment that you do get to sneak in, and I feel like, correct me if I'm wrong, you have talked in the Liberal Currents Discord about enjoying cultivation fiction. Is this right? Have I got you? And
There's a
do I
lot.
know what cultivation fiction is?
Okay, yeah, I mean, so over the last couple of years, I think my brother introduced me to Royal Road, which for those who do not know is a web fiction site where the things that are popular there are fantasy, science fiction, but of like a particular kind. Like there's what's called like lit RPG, where the fantasy world actually has things like RPG stats and stuff, and you level up and whatever. It's definitely a guilty pleasure, which I try and wean myself off of because I think it's a dumb premise. But I keep finding stories in it that I enjoy reading anyway.
Yeah.
There's, isekai, which is popular in anime, but like the whole idea of someone dies and ends up in a fantasy world. But yeah, the better ones are the like cultivation or Xianjia, which are essentially they're usually based in China, like in kind of what we might think of as medieval China, though that word doesn't really apply, but that era of China. And they're martial artists, but also they have, internal energy and power, and they're sort of cultivating and they grow until eventually they can ascend to godhood is like the end road of it.
Right.
I just mostly like any fiction like that where they're growing over time.
Right.
So like the most popular work on Royal Road is Mother of Learning,
Mm-hmm.
which is not any of the things I just described. It's just a fantasy, but it's a time loop fantasy where the person he's a student at a magic school, and through the time loop he learns more and more. Like basically, despite being in the body of a 15-year-old boy, he does this time loop, which is over the course of a whole month for years, and so he becomes kind of an expert in it, and I enjoy that but he doesn't just grow in power, he also learns a lot about the politics of the country and histories he didn't know and things. So like just in general, like being forced to grow is the kind of plot line that I like. And if I could read stories like that all the time, I would. But there are very few like that. They're usually the average story is going to be much more formulaic than like the very best ones, obviously.
Yeah, I feel like I have some awareness of this genre, like mainly through my partner. I think that the Netflix series The Untamed, which was based on a web novel called Modao Zushi, is in this category. Are you familiar
Okay.
with that one?
Oh yeah, no, definitely. I'm looking at it. Yes, definitely.
Yeah. So for listeners, I would lay reasonable odds that that is the most likely the main encounter they've had with this genre. I have to admit, I look on that kind of fiction, both as a writer and as a reader, with a real sense of jealousy, because it seems to me that as a genre there's a kind of frictionlessness in
Yeah,
its enjoyment, right?
yeah.
Because there is
That's
the
why, right? That's why.
yeah, it's just getting better, right? It's like you're on a ramp and the numbers go up and the characters improve and they
Exactly.
learn. And like it doesn't have to be like that, right? Like
Yeah.
the Untamed is not really, it's actually structured at least in the Netflix show as a real tragedy, where the characters have gotten stronger and smarter and better in some ways, but a lot of it happened off screen and you're seeing them then come up against these obstacles that end up destroying them,
Right,
in a lot of
right.
cases, that most of which are social. But I do love the idea, and I feel like because frictionless entertainment is a little bit easier to find in television and video games, like I feel like frictionless fiction
Yeah.
has been de-emphasized a little bit, and I
Yeah.
kind of wish it would come back, because like you talk about it with like a little bit of embarrassment, right? Like you called it a guilty
Indeed.
pleasure, and I knew when I brought it up I was like, this is a little bit of a trust exercise for
No, it's
Adam,
fine.
because
It's
I
fine.
don't know if you want to come forward with that
I
per
don't hide
se.
it. I don't believe in hiding it. Yeah.
but but like it is treated as a lesser thing in the world of fiction, I think. But I'm sitting here like, I mean, what would I give to live in the society where this was the frictionless
Yeah,
fiction, where these were
yeah,
the stories that are just pure pleasure that people are spending time with versus the movies or the video games or
yeah. I
whatever.
mean, listen, even in comics though, like Webtoons is a huge successful publisher. They are. They make tons of money. They get tons of attention. And that's another thing that I read, by the way. Uh,
Yeah.
if I were to recommend one in this cultivation or Jangia genre for people to check out, it wouldn't be a Royal Road one. It would be a Webtoons, a comic called Return of the Mad Demon, which is ongoing now. And it's just really well done. And it's also incredibly funny. Like it is, I don't know. Every single week it makes me laugh. It's really good, really well written, and really doesn't take itself seriously, which is my favorite kind of thing like this. And it has all the elements I like, which is yes, it's progressive, but also he was an old man, like in his middle-aged man who is sent back in time to when he's a young man. So I also always enjoy that plot device. And yeah, it's incredibly effortless, right? On Webtoons is built for your phone, and they really encourage you to do it. I'm not entirely sure why. Like I think maybe there's something with their advertising model there is the reason. Like you can usually read some of the chapters on a computer, but it's designed visually for your phone, and you're just literally scrolling down. It's like one page. A chapter is just one and never ending page all the way down to the bottom that you're scrolling down visually. And yeah, it's very effortlessness. So I think it does exist. I mean, listen, TV and movies are always going to be more, and video games are always going to be more money than the written word and even than comics, just because they're bigger productions, period, right? And like it is just lower effort to sit and absorb. But I think low effort, low friction, as you put it, fiction is pretty big right now. It's just underestimated, and it's underestimated for the same reason that just traditional genre fiction, gets estimated by literary writers and things like that. This is just sort of like a level deeper, right? This is even if you're a fantasy fan, you're a little embarrassed to be a lit RPG fan, right? Like it's like that. It's like just a level deeper than that.
When I was in South Korea, webtoons are big there. Particularly in the, I was there doing a residency in a city called Bucheon, which has sort of declared itself the city of webtoons and manhwa. Manhwa being the Korean word for manga, essentially. And I would be on the train, and I would see people holding their phone with one hand and scrolling with their thumb, and they're doing a webtoon, and it had that infinite scroll like you talked about. I actually was in a building that was across from the manhwa and webtoon museum, and it was
Oh, nice.
specifically built. It was this big, huge, South Korean apartment building where that they had constructed for webtoon artists to come live in and do their work
That's
under.
crazy.
And I met one. I got to hang out in his office a bit while he was working. His brother introduced me, and I don't think he actually wanted me to be there, but it was really fascinating because they are so, like you said, they're frictionless, they're really friendly, they're meant to be read with one hand on your phone in the subway,
Yeah,
but they are technically accomplished
yeah,
because there is that money thrown at them and there's so much talent in that talent pool. They're technically
yeah.
accomplished in a way that would blow people away, and I totally recommend checking them out.
Yeah, and no, it's really fascinating to me actually how good they are, like artistic wise. I grew up reading web comics, English language web comics, and at the time as a kid, a teenager, and in my 20s, I thought it's so great that there's no constraints. Like artists can just do whatever they want, and web comic artists would do things like they would have animated components, and the size of it didn't have to fit the traditional panel, and things like that. Stuff that Bill Watterson would have loved, for example, because he was always fighting for more space for Calvin and Hobbes in the paper to go crazy. But the flip side is webtoons are incredibly constrained. It's not just that it's a small screen, it's vertical, it's not horizontal. So, like a fight that is happening in these martial arts one that's going what would be multiple panels in a panel comic, the fight has to go down essentially. Like it's as if you're sort of like looking at it from an angle, and they're showing multiple stages of a fight occurring as you're scrolling down, but they pull it off. That's what's great. is these are very skilled artists doing very good art, and they're making it work in a very constrained frame, and it's fascinating. Yeah, it's fascinating.
Are there other cultivation stories that you would recommend to folks who are curious about the genre?
There's one that I read that I wouldn't recommend reading all of because it's just incredibly long. And that's another aspect of like Royal Road stories and like web fiction is especially because people build their audiences by just having like weekly or daily releases that go on for a long, long time. They're just incredibly long, some of them. And this one is called Elder Cultivator. I enjoyed it because it's very different from the typical. The guy has lived to be 100 just in his natural life. He's at the end of his life, and then for various reasons, he starts cultivating then, and it's very different from everything else in the genre. But it follows what I like about the genre, which is the idea that there's this sort of infinite ramp upward. Like from that, for them, they have this idea of what the top is, but they get to it in the series, and then they just keep going up. Like they keep finding, they just keep pioneering new, arenas beyond it. But it's fun. It's fun to read like one third of.
So you like attain godhood in chapter 100, and then it turns out that there are other gods that you need to manage, and then chapter 200 you attain uber godhood, and then it turns out that there's uber gods, and there's a conflict happening on another level. Is that kind of the structure of that?
Yeah, it's a bit quirky in terms of what it all is, but like essentially they think, okay, you reach a certain point and then you ascend to a higher realm. And some of them do that. The main character takes a different path where he essentially gets as strong as that, but stays in the lower realm, quote unquote. And he keeps like pioneering different paths like that. But the people who ascend also find out that like once you're there, there's yet other steps on the ladder. So it just keeps going. It gets a little bit absurd because the initial premise is he's an old man who's starting out where young people do, but at a certain point they're all like thousands of years old or something, and so his actual age difference from like his grandkid is not meaningful.
Right.
He goes around acting like an old man, but everyone else that he knows is also hundreds or thousands of years old. It's sort of moot, which is why at a certain point it kind of loses its appeal to me. But in the beginning, it's very charming and enjoyable.
Right. Yeah, that is a thing. I definitely I would feel that loss if the premise is it's interesting that this person is nearer the end of their life than the beginning, and they're starting this big project, and then it turns out actually that their life up to that point was extremely small by comparison to
Right.
what they were going to be
Exactly.
doing going forward.
Exactly. Yeah, the parts that I enjoy, basically, I just started skimming at a certain point. I did make it to the end. And the parts I would enjoy is that he would go to some new place that they hadn't been to before and just sort of start from scratch there with there to establish contact, not really saying who he was or where he came from or anything. So for a brief moment, it's kind of like it was very early on, where he's just this strange, mysterious figure, and you're learning this new world and things. But yeah, for the most part, it's the first like third or so that are a lot of fun.
I've been doing a bad job. I go into interview mode so much when I do these, and I've been trying to remind myself that I need to talk about what I'm reading too. And this makes a transition into some of that, because I've talked before on this show about how I think that there is a lot of tension right now in the creative writing world, in the academy. People who are teaching fiction, who are accustomed to teaching literary fiction, and they are dealing more and more with students who have already cut their teeth in a real way, and in some cases developed like surprisingly large audiences, writing fan fiction, writing, web novels and things that are not necessarily part of the cultivation genre that you're talking about, or like that universe, but like are part of the culture of web novels, of web fiction that has sprung partly out of that and partly out of places like AO3 and stuff, right? And so I am currently finishing up teaching a creative writing class online in connection with the University of Iowa for students who would like to learn about world building for speculative fiction. That's the focus of the class. And so there's, I think that the reason I mentioned the university is that I think that for a lot of people, the discomfort of having folks coming in with this like culture and tradition already sort of established in terms of like how you structure a story, what people are supposed to want in a story, what a story is expected to achieve. It's been totally reshaped by fan fiction, by web novels. And I think that there's a lot of resentment on the part of instructors in dealing with that. And like, I don't feel the resentment so much, but I'm wrapping this up and I am grading the assignments. And when I say grading, I'm making comments on them. I'm giving the students feedback, and then I am, everybody gets an A. Like you don't actually grade fiction generally, but it has been so interesting to try and create a learning environment for folks that are coming in with so much context already, and adjusting this from the last time I taught the same course, which was last year, trying to figure out like, how do I create the environment where they are going to do the work that they want to do and learn the things that they want to learn, but also work on some kind of fundamental skills that I think they need. The structure of this course has been that we create a shared world early on, and I give them the broad strokes of it. I name the place, I tell them what the rules are basically for it, and like what kind of people are there. And then each week we kind of build it out and talk about stuff that could happen in that world. And then at the end, they send me a story that is supposed to, it's like theoretically set in the world, but like in practice, there's a lot of contradictions that come up when people are collectively developing a world in that way. And so it's kind of their little version of it, right? It's their little shard. And last time that I taught this class, I created this really elaborate, complicated world for them to work with that had all these like counterbalancing forces, because I was thinking like, I want them to know that story emerges from conflict between people with different needs, especially in like a science fiction or a fantasy setting, right? And that worked okay, but it was definitely like, it was overwhelming for them. And I noticed a thread in their work that they were most comfortable when they started to embrace a kind of loose dream logic. And so this time around, I made the setting a city that is the world ended, and this city essentially teleported into the world of dreams, and it exists there forever now. And they are dealing with the dangers of existing in a dream space with dream logic, but also the opportunities. And I would say the experiment has been largely successful. I think that the students found it less overwhelming to try and deal with the world, but it is still, I don't know. I'm not totally satisfied with it, because now I feel like a dream is such a specific kind of feeling. And I feel like writers either really like it or they really don't care for it. And I can see the talented writers who, these are students who are like, 13 through 16 years old. Some of them are like really thriving with it. And then others are like, man, I wish this weren't in a dream setting. I wish this were anywhere else, man. This is, my eyes glazed over the second I read this description, and it's been 6 weeks of writing stuff I don't give a shit about. And it's hard to know how to balance that, but that is what I have been reading by and large this week. And it's been fun.
Nice.
Are there, when I invited you to be on the podcast and I said this was a show about reading, I would imagine there were a couple of things that came up for you. It was like, oh, maybe I'll talk about this. And I don't know that I've given you a chance to talk about any of them because of the way that I've directed things. Like, were there things that you expected to talk about that I haven't really given you space for?
No, that's fine. I guess I just want to say just a general point about reading then, which is that obviously we've been talking about fiction a bit. Don't feel embarrassed. People should not feel embarrassed about what it is they enjoy reading, and they should just read it. But in nonfiction, I will say that it is important to be a lifelong learner, that you shouldn't be embarrassed that you don't know something. That should just mean that there's a lot you can learn, and learning can be fun. I mean, the books can be difficult and challenging because not everyone on the topic you want to read is well written, or sometimes it's dense. Sometimes there's some social science empirical stuff that it's not like I'm going to pretend that I have mastery over the math, that they do, or the statistics, but I understand it enough, and I just feel willing to ask questions. Just be curious, I guess, is the bottom line. If you think about how long you were in school, and you think about how much of your life you likely have left, there's a lot more of the latter. And even if you're going to be reading nonfiction at a much slower pace, or being student-like at a much slower pace than you were in school when that was your whole thing you did, you can learn a lot. You can become pretty close to expert in a lot if you just are willing to be patient with how many years it'll take.
Yeah, something that I have come clean about on here because it is a cause of shame, and I've said that this is a show about reading is a show about shame because there is so much shame tied up in reading and what we don't read and what we should be reading and stuff. Like one of my main shames is that apart from history, and history is a real caveat, of course. I don't read much nonfiction. I am pretty bad about it. I read articles, and again, I do read history, and history gets you a lot of the stuff that you need in this regard. And certainly, if you're like a fiction writer, you need it. But I do struggle with nonfiction, and I ask myself why. And there's like a few reasons. I think one of the things that's kind of challenging right now is I'm very aware of how screwed up the structure is in publishing that leads to a nonfiction book existing. There's a reason
Sure,
I
fair.
focus on articles. That's often actually the better unit in which to write nonfiction because
It's
once you
true.
pitch a
Or a
book,
paper.
yeah, you gotta fill the whole book, right? Like and so you end up with like the majority of nonfiction books are like 40 to 60% actually the stuff they wanted to write, and then the rest of it is what they had to do to fill it out, so it counted as a book. So I mean, I think that is a real challenge, but like I think the thing that is hardest for me, the thing that I do feel shame about that I do have to overcome to follow your advice is I really struggle with feeling that I retained nonfiction. And I struggle with retaining fiction as well. Like I
Okay.
usually don't remember it that well afterward. I just don't have great memory. But of course with fiction, like it doesn't matter that much, right? Because like the theory is not really that you're necessarily there to learn and improve yourself. You're not there to cultivate. With nonfiction, one is there to cultivate to an extent, right? Like you are
Hmm.
trying to learn and grow and to retain things. So I'm just kind of curious, like what your relationship to that is. Like is that how do you feel about the learning, retention, self improvement part of nonfiction?
No, that's a very good point. I think if it's okay with you, after I answer your question, I'll end with like a
Yeah.
few nonfiction recommendations for people.
Yes, please.
But before that, I'll answer your question. First is I think I actually am just lucky in one way. I have terrible memory about a lot of things. I can't remember the things I'm supposed to do in my daily life to make my household not fall apart. Like basic things. But I do have a pretty good memory for stories for whatever reason. Like I can remember Buffy the Vampire Slayer episodes within like 5 minutes of the first 5 minutes or so, what the rest of the plot of the episode is. Um, and but also nonfiction. Like if I read about history and I read about these things, I don't necessarily remember things like dates, but I remember a lot of the basic structural points. I'm just lucky to have that said, the only way I ever really come to grips with nonfiction is by writing about the things I'm thinking about, right? Talking about it and writing about it. And people can find this very obnoxious. Part of the reason I started writing online in the first place was because I wanted to air out things I was thinking about without bothering anyone. So they had to come to me rather than me getting in their face. I still do get in their face though. But so actually, like working through part of retention, I think, is actually working through what you've read. So it's reading it, but then talking to someone about it and writing something, even very short something, trying to work out your thoughts about it and your questions or what you didn't understand. And for some people, that's not easy, right? For me, that's like I struggle to write fiction, even though I would like to, frankly. But I have for so many years at this point written nonfiction that's honestly easier for me than not doing so. And even jotting down some unstructured thoughts and notes usually helps me. But then also like one thing I will say to people is if you read something and don't understand it and it is by an academic specifically, you can email that academic. 9 times out of 10, they will reply very generously to your questions. And sometimes it's about things that are not even in their books. So to give a very specific example, one thing I think is important is proportional representation, the specific mechanism in legislatures that some countries have and that our country should have it. One thing that another like political science person said was, well, an important thing that members of Congress do is constituency services. This is something that a lot of Americans don't even realize, but like way more time is spent in congressional offices on constituency services than on legislation. So that's like constituents have reached out and asked for help or had questions, and the member of Congress tries to help them. And they said in a proportional system, so like a purely proportional system would be like, imagine if every state, instead of having one district per seat, the entire state was one district, and whatever percentage of the vote Democrats got, they would get that percentage of the state's seats, and vice versa for the Republicans. But then there's no real one Democrat who is your Democrat in that state, right? For the House of Legislatures. So they said, so who then does constituent services? And that was a good point, I thought. And so I reached out to some political scientists who I'd read and essentially said, hey, what's the literature on this, on like how much constituency services get done in the different kinds of systems? And they did not know the answer. So not only did they give me their best guess, but they like looped in another guy who was an expert in the area and was like, what do you think about this? What's good reading on this? And they essentially like pointed me in the direction of reading more. So I think don't underestimate the willingness of people who are experts to help you because they like people that actually care about the topic.
Yeah, and if you're hearing this and you're thinking, well, maybe that's just because Adam is like a cool guy who runs a publication or whatever. Like I am nobody, and I have had the same experience. Like they're just so happy to hear from you and to,
Yeah, no,
to know that you care.
and I did this. I did this in like 2013 or 2014 or something when I didn't have a publication, and it was the same thing. And I was writing about pretty esoteric like stuff, philosophical stuff. Okay, so I will give you some recommendations though.
Yes.
And I think these are good. These are great nonfiction books to read if you're not necessarily a general nonfiction reader, but that you'll get something out of. And you'll find the first one funny. You may have heard of it or read it yourself or just talked about it. It's Pierre Bayard, and the title is How to Talk About Books You Haven't Read.
Uh-huh.
And I have read it. I have read it. It's very good. It's very good. But it talks about that shame component that you're talking about as well, that you're supposed to have read things. I haven't read Marx either. Many of the liberal canon of writers, I have either read lightly or not. Like I have not read Rawls in depth.
Yeah.
I've read On Liberty by John Stuart Mill. I've not read his other stuff. I've not read the two treatises by Locke. I have read the Letter on Toleration, but I've read a lot about them. And obviously, if you want to be an expert at any one of them, you should do both. Like, so I went through a period of reading Hans George Gadamer, who's a continental philosopher. I did read his stuff. I read a lot of secondary stuff too. Like that's something. But like, you can't read everyone. You really cannot. And that should not stop you from talking educatedly about them.
Yeah.
And this is a good book about that. Another good book that I think everyone should read, that should be part of your high school education, frankly, is a book called A Different Democracy. And this has 4 authors, and I won't list them all, but it's called A Different Democracy, American Government in a 31-Country Perspective. And it just answers the basic question of, okay, how different is America's system of government from other countries? Why is it different? Like, how did that happen? And it's a short book. It's not actually a long book. It's very systematic in what it compares to other things. And it says things like, okay, this is different because the founding fathers literally wrote the Constitution before we realized X, Y, and Z. So proportional representation that I just mentioned, that is something that really became developed for legislatures in the late 19th century. So it did not exist at the time that the Constitution was drafting. So of course they didn't think of it. But they also didn't even pick the allocation method at all in the Constitution. They just said, all right, it's up to the states to figure it out. Right. Because they had no idea how important that is. Like, so much comes down to the rule that you pick in terms of power. So nowadays, when you have a constitutional convention because a country has been conquered in war, after World War II, say, or they're just going through a democratization, post-authoritarianism, and they want to adopt a new constitution, the very first thing that they pick is the voting, the election system, right? That's like the first one that they want to nail out because they know that it matters so much. Well, the founders didn't know that because there wasn't a lot of precedent for it. Right. So a lot of what flows from that is just the incentives that end up getting set up when they allow so much flexibility for that. Other things are more like, for very contingent reasons, we created the direct primary system of nomination in this country, and more state governments took control of it, so that actually we are the only country in the world that has a nomination system that is administered by government officials. Like, the party's own nomination system is administered by government officials. Primaries do exist in other places, but we have the most open. Essentially, any U.S. citizen can vote in a primary, which is not the case in other countries that have primaries. So things like that, where some of it is just the contingency of the founders could never have foreseen it. And others are like, we've built for various specific historical reasons some choices institutionally that kept snowballing and are difficult to get out of. And both of those, by the way, I think are bad. They're not good things about our system.
Yeah.
But not everything not everything in the book, I would say, that is a difference that we have is bad. But also many things that we have in common with other countries are good. So it's that a different democracy. Definitely recommend that one. Now I got to think. I'm going to think of one that is not like an academic. So that one is like actually not academic publishing level pricing. Thank God. A lot of the other stuff I would recommend is like, oh, academic presses are so expensive.
Yeah.
Like Rationalism, Pluralism, and Freedom is a book that I love by Jacob Levy. But it's like $40 or something. I mean, if you can get it at your library, I definitely recommend it though.
Yeah.
Rationalism, Pluralism, and Freedom. That's a good one. Okay, so that's 3. I'll stop at 3.
Okay.
And I will just say, seek out essays, seek out papers on topics. That's a better way, like you said, to quickly become familiar with the topic anyway. The real energy in academic work is in the papers, not in the books.
Right. Well, thank you for being on the show and taking the time to talk with me about this stuff. I really enjoyed it. We have a tradition for ending the show that was created by mistake, and I am always in the market for improvement. So if you have a suggestion for a better sign-off, I'd love to hear it. But traditionally what we do is we thank my cat, Tony, who is one of several cats and contributes nothing in particular to the show.
Well, thank you, Tony.
Thank you, Tony.
Library pizza. Pizza. Library pizza. Pizza.